morning. My name's David. I'm one of the pastors here at Watershed. Welcome. And I am pleasantly surprised that there are this many of you here on a long weekend. That is excellent. At least for me. Maybe it's perhaps not excellent for you. Maybe you had other plans that fell through or whatever. But I am happy to see you, so hopefully you're also happy to be here. So a couple things before I dive in this morning. This is not the last or first week of any series. It's actually like the fourth or fifth week of a series that has been ongoing since earlier this year. It's a series that we do in between series, and I'll tell you a little bit more about it in a second if you haven't been here for that. But we just wrapped up our plot twist series, and next week we have a brand new series we're kicking off with our special guests, Joe and Suzanne Stabil and Kim and ICU Talks. Yep. And that series is called Being Magic. And just a little bit about that. So if you are like me, you perhaps grew up in a tradition where anything that wasn't, not just Christian, but anything that wasn't a certain kind of Christian was demonized. And so any exploration of spirituality that came from another faith tradition, perhaps another strand of the Christian tradition, or things that were considered like secular or even pagan or just outside of the very narrow confines of a certain expression of evangelical Christianity were off limits. All right, so that could include things like the Enneagram, which we will learn about next week. It could include, again, like I said, other faiths or even other forms of Christianity. It could include other things like different disciplines like psychoanalysis or psychotherapy, or even other like spirituality, spiritual ideas like astrology, tarot, and things like that. So what this series is going to be, it's instead of demonizing those things, this is going to be an opportunity to dialogue with those things. We're going to be putting our Christian faith, or the Christian faith, if you don't claim it, in conversation with other traditions. It's not going to be exhaustive because there's only so many of us and so many weeks, and so we probably aren't going to be able to get to everything, but it's going to be sort of like a first words. We say this all the time, we're a community of first words, not last words. It'll be first words quite literally for many of us when it comes to seeing how the Christian faith intersects with some of these things, and maybe even discovering and noting the fact that this is not a new thing. It might be new to us, but from the very beginning, Christianity has been this diversity, this plurality of disciplines and traditions that have always interacted and been in dialogue with other traditions. So join us for that. But today, I think someone said it was like week 4, week 5. We've been in this Mark series, Book of Mark, Mark in the Bible, if that wasn't obvious, for a number of months now. And in particular, we are using as our guide this book. I'm sure you can all see it super clearly from where you're sitting. It's called The Insurrection of the Crucified. It's by the late Theodore Jennings, who was a pastor, a theologian, a professor. If you are super curious, you can go back. We have a whole playlist on our YouTube channel where you can see all the previous talks in this. But the intro, where I was joined by my friend Shay Watts up here, who was a student of Ted Jennings in seminary, you can hear all about why we're following this person in particular, why their insight into the book of Mark is so meaningful for us. But, and this is, no, I'm not going to make this promise. I was going to say, this is the last time I'm going to share this joke, but it's not. I'm probably going to say this every single time we're doing one of these. This is your opportunity to tell your skeptical friends, and by skeptical, I mean skeptical about us, that we are taking an entire year, probably more, to walk through the book of Mark. And so, despite what you may have heard, we do take the Bible super seriously here. No, but seriously. So, and just as a sort of like FYI to kind of get us up to speed. So we are diving into Mark 4 and 5 this morning, which I'm sure makes all of you so excited. Mark 4 and 5. That's what we've been waiting for. We are getting to the point where, as I kind of look at the whole book and the book of Mark and stuff like that, I'm like, I'm gonna have to condense a few things. I'm going to have to skip a few things. So just so you know what you missed, or what everyone missed, you didn't miss it because you weren't here. You missed it because I'm not going to do it. There's some parables. And here's the thing. We at Watershed love parables. In fact, we've done multiple series on parables, including some of these parables in the past. I am almost certain we will do more series on parables again in the future. The one thing I want you to get from these parable passages that I'm completely skipping are that this is maybe the first time in Mark's retelling that something that's very crucial for this morning becomes kind of obvious. And that's that Mark is trying to do two things at once, at least two things at once. And by Mark, I just mean whoever wrote it. We don't know who wrote it. In fact, Professor Jennings uses she, her pronouns to describe the author, just to hammer home the fact that we genuinely don't know who wrote this, and that the community of faith, at its infancy, at its inception, was diverse and celebrated female leadership. So we do too. But the thing that I think is crucial to kind of understand going into this is that whoever wrote Mark, not only are they trying to sort of tell the story of Jesus, and even insofar as they're doing that, they're not necessarily trying to tell it in the sort of chronological, like historic, the way that we understand history. That's not their priority. Their main priority, perhaps even more so than that, however, is they are giving a message to their immediate community in the present tense. And they are using the story of Jesus in order to communicate something to a community that ostensibly, allegedly, is already following Jesus, but seems to have run aground, in a sense, when it comes to fulfilling the calling or the mission given to them as followers of Jesus. And so it's important for us to understand that, like, the audience for this is hearing something in real time, and we, in a way, and there's nuance to this, but in a way we can sort of put ourselves in their shoes. Our context is very different from theirs. We don't live in the first century Roman Empire, but we do live in an empire. And so we can sort of, with sort of generous humility, kind of put ourselves in their shoes and sort of hear the message from Mark sort of fresh and anew for ourselves, just as they did. So that's your setup. That's the setup for the setup. Here's the setup. So if you're familiar with me, and there's a number of new people here today, so some of you aren't, so just sort of to familiarize yourself, this is normally where I would introduce some kind of nerd reference. Something like Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, anime, something like that. But I'm not going to do that this morning. I am going to talk about sports. And this is a running joke. I actually probably spend more time during the week thinking and reading and doing sporty things than I do with nerdy things. I do it in the most me sort of way, in that I'm poring over statistical anomalies, and I'll put it this way: I probably enjoy the off season of all my favorite sports the most, because that's when the GMs get to work. They're making trades and signing free agents and balancing the budget and things like that. Really into that sort of thing. Probably why I spend a lot of time playing fantasy football, because then I get to cosplay as said GM. But I also love the sports film as a genre. Always have. And one of the things I love about the sports film is there's probably not a piece of art or media that better captures sort of the human experience of the miraculous. The impossible made possible than the sports film. You can probably think, any number of sports films off the top of your head, and there's a moment where a miracle, or we might even call it like a secular miracle, happens. It sort of blurs the line between, the material and the spiritual, but something transcendent happens. And one of my favorite sports films of all time is Remember the Titans. For a lot of reasons, but one of my favorite scenes in Remember the Titans, and it's, we're past the point where if you haven't seen it yet, too bad, because I'm going to spoil something from it. That came out when I was in elementary school, so you're good. But there's a moment when the starting quarterback, Rev, he gets hit in sort of a dirty way. It's a football movie, if that wasn't clear. He gets sacked, and by a team that they're playing, full of just total racists. Rev's an African-American quarterback, and so they have this backup quarterback who they call Sunshine, because he's from California. He's got these long flowing hair. Yeah. I think that was Jonathan. And so they put Sunshine in, and he's massively talented, but hasn't had any game time yet. So he's coming in kind of raw and unprepared. But he talks to his offensive lineman, and he says, "Let him through." as in like when they start rushing the passer, let them through. See, I know sports lingo, rushing the passer. Let him through. And so he does that. And so right as this opposing player is about to sack him, Sunshine kind of bends over and just flips him, tricks him. It's very athletic what he does, I think. I couldn't do it. But the transcendent moment is a moment of trickery. And so that's the other thing I kind of want to draw attention to today. We're going to be looking at stories of the miraculous, but you're going to miss it. You're going to misunderstand if you think that the point of the story is the miracle. The point of the story, the thing that makes it transcendent, the thing that makes it sort of like a glimpse into possibility, is almost the comedy of it, the trickery of it, the almost the mundane normalcy of it. You see, the thing about the Bible, and I think especially the Gospels and the book of Mark, maybe even more so than any of the other Gospels, is the way that they sometimes don't want us to see the divine where we expect to see the divine. The divine is actually hidden in plain sight, sometimes in the normal, in the mundane, in the unclean, in the rejected or the outcast or the marginalized. The divine is always where we're not trained to look for it. And it's in those moments that it sort of bursts forth as this sort of miraculous revelation of where God actually is and what God is actually up to in the story. So, Mark 4, the moment you've all been waiting for. So this is, I think, for those of you who are raised in sort of a Sunday school-ish context, these are going to be familiar stories. The first is going to be the story about Jesus calming the sea. So we pick this up in Mark chapter 4. It'll be on the screen. Here it goes. On that day, when evening had come, he says to them, "Let us go to the other side." And leaving the crowd, they take him with them just as he was, worded very weirdly it seems, in the boat, and other boats were with them. So a couple things I want you to notice right off the bat. The first is, this is mostly in the present tense, right? So again, first clue right off the bat that maybe the author of Mark isn't just telling us something that happened, but making it present tense is actually placing the audience, and then by extension perhaps us, into the action, into the moment. Mark is often accused, or scholars speculate that the person who wrote Mark is probably not as well educated because the grammar is kind of inconsistent and all over the place. I actually disagree with that interpretation. I think the author of Mark, and it could be authors of Mark, this could have been sort of a communal writing, but whoever wrote Mark is incredibly strategic and incredibly nuanced in the way that they're telling this story. So it being in the present tense is key. There's another thing. It says, they take him being Jesus, with them just as he was. That's a weird detail to add, I think. It will become less weird in a moment when you see why, or when I try to explain or sort of unpack why that detail was added, as well as this thing about and other boats were with them. Again, all of this is for the original audience, all of this is inviting them to see themselves in the story and not just sort of be detached from it as if it's a story about people who came before them or about someone else. Let's continue. Next verse. And a great windstorm comes up, and the waves smashed into the boat and flooded it. And he was in the stern asleep on the pillow. And they awaken him, present tense, and say to him, "Teacher, don't you care that we are dying?" And he says, taking up, rebuked, I think I mistyped that, I think it's waking up, rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Shut up, muzzle it." And the wind stopped, and there was a total hush. He said to them, "Why are you cowards? Haven't you got any faith?" And they were terrified and said to one another, "Who is this guy that the wind and the sea obey him?" All right, so again, remember, present tense. Also note, he's asleep, and remember, it talked about, they took him just as he was. This is kind of confusing, and we actually haven't gotten into the story enough for this to be justified. You're just going to have to trust me at this point. But there's this weird thing about Mark's narrative in particular, where the resurrected Jesus almost seems to show up earlier in the story. So an interesting thing about Mark is we actually don't ever encounter a truly resurrected Jesus at any point in the story. Again, spoiler alert, but it's been out for a really long time, so you should know how it ends already. But the part in Mark where they actually encounter the resurrected Jesus was probably almost certainly not part of the original text. It was added later. The original text of Mark, and we'll get to this and you'll have forgotten it by then, but the original text of Mark ends with an empty tomb. And the people who found the empty tomb, terrified. It literally just, it's like a David Lynch film. It's like, and they were terrified. Roll credits. All right? So we don't actually get to encounter the resurrected Jesus in the narrative, but we do. Because a resurrection-y Jesus pops up in the story multiple times, including right here. And so there's something almost going on where the story is setting up a dead Jesus, or in this case, an asleep Jesus, standing in for the crucified or the dead Jesus, and then something happens, a certain failure on the part of the disciples, on the part of the followers. In this case, they're the way that they're responding to this storm, which could be understood literally or more metaphorically. And then all of a sudden, a authoritative sort of resurrected Jesus shows up, but then he does the thing that you'd expect in a way, and this is a very literal translation, the way that it says shut up and muzzle it. He does it in a comical way. He's not necessarily doing it in the way that you would anticipate sort of a conquering, kind of kingly, divine, powerful deity figure to do it. He does it almost in this sort of tricksterish way. And that's really key. Because here's the thing that the author is trying to get us, or trying to get his audience or her audience or their audience to see, and by extension maybe us to see, is not the thing that most of us have been taught. Because see, if you're like me, most of us have been taught that the point of this story is to just prove that Jesus was God or was divine in some way, because, But here's the thing, Mark's audience already believed that. They already knew that. It should not have been shocking to them, just like in many ways it should not have been shocking to the disciples in the narrative to see Jesus do something miraculous. He had done a lot of miraculous things by chapter 4 here. So faith in this context, and remember, he rebukes him. He says, "Why are you cowards? Haven't you got any faith?" Faith in this context cannot mean the thing that most of us have been told it means, which is just believing the right things about Jesus. They would have already done that. It has to mean something else. And I want to contend to you this morning that it's in some way tied to this trickster, this audacious version of Jesus who calms the storm in this sort of flippant, sarcastic, sort of uncouth sort of way. All right? So keep that in mind as we move to the next part, to the next passage. So continuing, they came to the other side of the sea, to the country of, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce that, Gerasenes. That's probably wrong. We're just going to go with it. Gerasenes. They came to Gerasenes. And I want to pause here for a moment. It's really, really important that you hear and see in this language of the other side, this crossing of the sea. This is almost a resetting of the story. So up to this point, Jesus' ministry and the ministry of his disciples has been working in Galilee, which is the northern area of Palestine, around the Sea of Galilee. Nazareth, where Jesus was from, is up there. So they've mostly had home court advantage, for good or bad. Another sports metaphor. They've been working amongst people who shared their customs, shared their assumptions, their beliefs, their culture, and things like that. This notion of going to the other side is framing this as a move to what we would know as Gentile regions. Different assumptions, spiritually, culturally, religiously, etc. Okay, that's really key. It's also important to remember, as I name this, that Mark's audience, the audience that this is being written to, almost certainly in a Gentile context. They themselves might be Jewish, either ethnically or religiously. That might be how they identify, but almost certainly in a Gentile context, somewhere in the Roman Empire, perhaps modern-day Turkey, modern-day Jordan. Jordan would be an interesting one because this place that they go, that I can't pronounce, is in what is modern-day Jordan, the country of Jordan. So that's key. That's key, seeing the other side as moving into this alien, sort of foreign context. So, and when he had come out of the boat, immediately there met him from the graveyard a man with an unclean spirit who lived, but let's go with loved. I like that better, that's more fun. Who loved in the graveyard. You can imagine what you want there. And no one was able to bind him, even with a chain, any longer, because he had often been bound with chains and fetters, and the chains were broken and the fetters shattered into pieces, and no one could subdue him. So clearly they want us to understand the graveyard thing. There's an association here with death or uncleanliness. So that's key. Kind of add that to your repertoire of details. Let's keep going. And always by day and night among the graves, because remember he's in a graveyard, and in the mountains he was shrieking and slashing himself with rocks. And seeing Jesus from a distance, he ran and honored him. Okay, interesting. And crying with a loud voice, he says, "What is it to you and me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?" Pause there. We read that and we're like, cool, a normal title for Jesus. They hear that and they think, that's a weird way of saying that. You see, if you look at earlier passages in the book of Mark that involve demons and exorcisms, the demons also recognize Jesus, but they call him something different. See, in the earlier passages, they used titles and honorific names for Jesus that were distinctly Jewish. Son of the Most High God is Roman. It's pagan. So right off the bat, we're seeing that these are a different sort of unclean spirit. This is a different sort of demon. It's addressing him from an outside or alien, not alien, you get what I mean. From an alien culture, from a different spirituality, a different spiritual vantage point, okay? And he says, "What is it to you and me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?" And now here's the thing. You're going to miss what's about to happen. "I command you in the name of God that you not torment me." For he had said to him, "Come out of the man, unclean spirit." Okay. The way that I was originally taught this is that this is Jesus talking to the graveyard guy. But no, the graveyard guy is trying to exorcise Jesus. So the graveyard guy is coming, we're just going to call him that now, graveyard guy. Graveyard guy is coming, and in the name of his gods, is trying to exorcise, from his perspective, the demon that is Jesus. So again, hammering home sort of the clash of cultures that they're experiencing here, but also that Mark's audience would have expected. Because the way that they traditionally understood these things was in a competitive either-or manner. And that to be part of a faith or a religion or a spirituality, these are our terms. That's not how they understood it back then. The marriage between culture and faith was much different than the way that we try to keep those things separate. At least we say, and then we go and do things politically that don't reflect that. But at least in their context, these things were meant to be understood separately, all right? I mean, not separately, like overlapping and stuff like that. But to be the follower of a certain God was to then to put that God in competition over against other gods. And they often understood that these deities or these gods regionally, like the God of Israel was literally the God of Israel, as in like not just the people of Israel, but the region of Israel, of Palestine, okay? And then that God was in competition with, the regional gods of other cultures, other city-states, other nations and whatnot, okay? So again, the idea that this graveyard guy was going to be trying to exorcise a competing deity, or at least the representative of a competing deity out, not abnormal. The surprising thing, at least for us, is that, he's doing the thing that we're expecting Jesus to do to him. So how does Jesus respond? Next verse. Next verse. I have it in here as well. I can look at it. Thanks. All right. So again, Jesus, graveyard guy tries to exorcise Jesus, and then Jesus just is like, "Hey man, what is your name?" All right. And he replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." So again, right off the bat, so Jesus is just sort of like diffusing the tension, saying, "What's your name?" This guy literally just ran up to him and tried to like cast him out in the name of some pagan god. And Jesus is like, "What's your name?" he responds and he says, legion, which really only had one meaning back then. You know, we've done this whole thing like Pilgrim's Progress did or whatever, you know, John Bunyan and all these other conservative guys who are kind of like, oh, you know, this is, you know, it's the name of all these demons and blah, blah. It's a reference to the Roman legionnaires, all right? This is Roman occupied imperial territory. And so naming himself as legion is immediately drawing a connection to military imperial occupiers and then associating them with death. Remember, graveyard guy, all right? We are legion, we are many. And he begged him eagerly not to send them out of the country, all right? So at this point, the unclean spirit, being associated with Roman occupation, is now begging Jesus, don't send us out of this region. Don't send us out of this country. And so Jesus does this thing, which if you've heard this story a million times like me, is easy to kind of overlook and miss. But he does something comedic. He does something tricksterish. Because the legion begs him, he says, now a great herd of pigs was feeding on the hillside, and they begged him, send us to the pigs, let us enter them. So he gave them leave, and the unclean spirits came out and entered the pigs, and the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea and were drowned. All right, so for a few reasons, Mark's audience would have seen this as funny. They would have seen it as funny because Jesus tricked the demons into going into the pigs and the pigs drowned themselves. They would have seen it as funny because pigs in the Jewish faith were considered to be unclean. And so they kind of went from graveyard, unclean to unclean. And so basically, rather than a show of force, Jesus used a sleight of hand, so to speak, to sort of clear the region of an occupying force. This would have been sort of a subversive kind of aha moments, but before the Jewish-friendly audience of Mark gets too comfortable, the author's about to subvert the story again. So let's continue on the next passage. The herdsmen fled and told it in the city and the country, and people came to see what it was that had happened. And they came to Jesus, and they saw the demoniac sitting there, graveyard guy, clothed and in his right mind, the man who had the legion, the man who was being oppressed by the occupying force. And they were afraid. And those who had seen it told what happened to the demoniac and to the pigs, and they began to beg Jesus to depart from their neighborhood. This is not a foreign story to us. We have someone who is being oppressed by an imperial force. That force is expelled, usually not by a comparable power, but by the subversiveness of a kind of trickster energy. And what do people get up in arms about? Property damage. That's just like there's nothing new under the sun. So they come up and they're like they're not excited for the person who is being oppressed by the legion. They're annoyed at the loss on their ledger. They're annoyed that all the pigs, you know. And at this point, again, Mark's audience is probably still like, haha, yeah, you know, we are superior, you know, get it to them. But then the next thing that is about to happen sort of subverts that. Next passage. And as he was getting into the boat, so this is Jesus. So Jesus listens to them. So they're like, get out of here, you know, stop defacing our property. And so Jesus is like, peace, you know, is about to peace out. And graveyard guy shows up, says the man who had been demonized, very intentional language, the man who had been demonized, begged him that he might be with him. So just to frame this, and this is where it begins to subvert, because this is what Mark's followers would have expected. The man's like, let me be one of you. Let me convert. Let me join your team. All right? But Jesus refused. He refused and said to him, go to your house. And the word for house here in the Greek kind of corresponds to shrine. Go to your house. Go back to your tribe. Go to your tradition. All right? To your people and report to them the things the Lord has done and how the Lord has had pity for you. And he went away and began to proclaim the Decapolis, the things that Jesus had done for him. And all people marveled. So remember, we start this story with the assumption that we are in a competition and that the people of Mark's audience, you know, the premise or sort of the starting point for this story is that they are floundering in some degree. They're encountering a storm, you could say. And so the purpose of this passage is to hearken back to the story of Jesus, to the narrative of his life. And these people are already followers of Jesus, the audience. And to give them some sign of wisdom, some kind of direction or counsel. And so in the first story, that wisdom, that direction, that counsel is you need to have more faith. And again, faith in this context is not you need to know the right things about Jesus. They already did. There was something about the audacity of Jesus' demonstration in the storm that was important. And then here again, we are given a very almost classic culture versus culture, God versus God, religion versus religion bout. And don't get me wrong, Jesus wins. Jesus is God wins, but the aftermath of that is not what they would have expected. They would have expected, let's add another adherent, a new follower. But no, Jesus says, no, you're good the way you are. Go back to your culture. Go back to your customs. To go back to your house, to your shrine, would have meant present yourself as clean in your way. You don't have to become like us. You can be who you always already were, and then through that lens, proclaim what God has done for you. See, sometime in the last 2,000 years, certainly after the life of Jesus, we got it in our heads that Jesus came to start a new religion. But that's not how Jesus saw himself. Jesus saw himself as Jewish, and it never questioned that. The idea here is that to be a follower of Jesus does not require you to leave and sort of like assimilate into this new power, into this new imperial whatever that is going to just be the new and better version of the power dynamics of the previous regime. But it's to know it's in your context, in your language, through your customs, through everything that is you, precisely as you are, you can experience and proclaim the power of God in your life. That is not what Mark's audience would have expected, but it also was a reminder to them because they were floundering. They were seeing themselves as this small fish, this in a big sea in the Roman Empire. They were looking at this huge empire and thinking, how can we possibly make a difference? How can we possibly follow Jesus? How can we possibly sort of proclaim this kingdom of Jesus, this kingdom of God in this context? We don't have the power. And the author of Mark comes in and just through this narrative involving the Jesus who they already knew, who they already understood his identity, kind of comes in and says, that is not how Jesus functions. The power of Jesus is not in military might. It's not in power as we typically understood it. It's subversive. It's tricksterish. It's almost comedic. And so is faith. Faith is not believing the right things. It's not having just positive sort of mental or emotional assent into the boxes that we could check. If that was the case, Jesus would have let Graveyard Guy join them because he would have then been checking the right boxes. But Jesus said, no, go back and tell what God has done for you. And so it's not going to be until later in the narrative that we're able to really, really understand the nature of faith. But we're at least given sort of glimpses here. The introduction to the idea that the audacity of faith is found not in the grandiose, but in the mundane, in the normal, in the familiar, in the sense that it's not about just abandoning everything you were and kind of your context and all that stuff, but it's about almost like being exactly where you always already were, but with a different posture, kind of through a different lens. I'm supposed to say zebra to call the band back up, so if they can hear me, zebra. That was their idea. I don't totally understand it, but they should be back up in a moment. But no, it's faith is it's not about just believing harder or righter. It's about subverting the norm. Or it's about inviting the norm to be related to in a completely different way, an audacious way, a kind of radical way. And this is what kind of brings together, my opening example about the sports film, particularly the example I used that had sort of this trickster element in it. The thing that I think I think, and maybe I'm totally wrong about this, but the thing that I love about sports is the way that something that seems transcendent can happen in something very normal. Now, maybe you don't look at sports, especially professional sports, and see normal because they're elite athletes or whatever. But at the end of the day, they're just doing things with their bodies, and we have those. All of our bodies are different, but at the end of the day, they're not like Marvel superheroes. They're not like shooting laser beams or moving things with their mind. They're not Jedi. They're people. And yet, there can be these moments in sport, and it's not limited to sport. It can be moments in art. It can be moments in conversation. There are these moments where the transcendent sort of breaks into the finite. The infinite breaks into the finite. The transcendent breaks into the immanent. Those audacious moments that are hidden in plain sight in the mundane and the normal, that is where the author of Mark is inviting us, not just to look for God or look for Jesus or practice our faith, but to actually live out sort of that very same divinity that Jesus embodied, not in the ways that he was anticipated to embody it, but the ways that Jesus embodied divinity precisely in his own humanity. All right? So that's going to be sort of like the driving theme for the rest of the book of Mark, right up to the end. Remember, I already spoiled the end for you, so when we finish this series next Easter, so you already know what happens. But really going forward, that's the lens that I invite you to have, this lens of not pitting the human and the divine against each other, not pitting different faith traditions against each other, not pitting the natural and the supernatural against each other, but sort of in this weird, beautiful way, finding God, finding the divine, finding the transcendent, precisely in us. And that's what I'm going to leave you with. Grace and peace.